Well, thank you, Bora, for having me, and thanks to the whole SMU and Tower Center community. I was really looking forward to coming and visiting Dallas and seeing you all. So this is what I get instead. So I'm really hoping for a good conversation afterwards, and I'm looking forward to a discussion with Vishak. So with that, let me get started here. So here I am sitting in my office at Princeton University, and I think just the fact that we are having this conversation the way we are indicates that we're living in a pretty unusual time. And I think that we can all think of ways in which our politics and our society have really kind of gone in, I think, some pretty peculiar directions in the last few years. And what I would present to you is that from the point of view of how democracy operates as we're used to it, it's a really unusual time in our history. It's in some ways a turning point. And we're at a crossroads where we are going to work out what our government, what our democracy, and what our society are going to look like. And so I'm going to show you some evidence today that, that statistically and numerically support my case. And let me back up a step and say that I'm a working scientist. Here I am at my university in my office. I run a laboratory. And really, I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a historian. I'm not a lawyer, nor a law scholar. What I am is a data guy. And I've gotten into this kind of unusual activity here at Princeton, where I run a research group where what we do is we do policy work to try to make democracy work a little bit better. And although I don't have specialty knowledge in those domains, I've got a team of people here. And what we do is we work on using law, math, and data to help democracy work better and to think of ways in which it can work better for as many of its citizens as possible. So, so that's what we do here at Princeton. And what I'd like to do is tell you today, let me just get my slides started here. Let's see if I can do this in the age of Zoom. Okay, so that should work. And let's see. Vishak, is my whole screen visible now? It's in projection mode?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about a bug in democracy. That thing on the left is a bug indicating a problem with democracy. And I'm going to talk about ways in which we have these strange features in our democracy. Let's call it democracy 1.0. And this democracy 1.0 is what tech people call a legacy. There's just things left over from when it was installed several hundred years ago. There were some bug patches, some fixes that our founders and then their associates and some descendants along the way and other Americans tried to bring along to fix the system. And now we've got this patchwork that, that works most of the time, but also has some deficiencies in terms of little d democracy, that is representing the people, or little r republicanism, that is responding to the people. And so although we don't have a fully democratic nor fully Republican society and government, we're kind of working on it. And I think that this is, as I said, a turning point where we have what I would say, well, I was going to say that it's the most important election of our lifetimes, but I think maybe we had that one in 2016. I would say it's the most important remaining election of our lifetimes. And so what I'd like to show you today is ways in which math can illuminate this, ways in which math helps me thinking about gerrymandering and representation. And in particular, I want to show you something kind of interesting, which is that it's a really happy coincidence that I'm visiting you all in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, because over here on the right side of this introductory slide, this is a calculation that we've done showing that some of the most valuable voters in the country, some of the most powerful voters in the country are in fact found in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You can see here in Dallas County, Tarrant County, I believe that's Denton and Collin County, if I have it correct. These counties are among the most powerful counties and have among the most powerful voters in America when it comes to, in fact, redistricting. And I will tell you about that. And what that means is that many of you have an unusual amount of leverage this election, and I really encourage you to use that leverage. And that'll be an endpoint for showing you how I think about data. And I should say that this is work done by the Gerrymandering Project at Princeton. We've established a newish research project called the Electoral Innovation Lab. And the Electoral Innovation Lab, as I said, is working on different ways of repairing and improving democracy. So if you're ever in Princeton, which someday we'll be able to travel, I hope you will come and drop by. So let me now situate our time here. As I said, it's a pretty odd time, but there are ways in which mathematically it looks like we've been here before. This is a graph about the presidency, and although I'm mostly going to talk about representation today, this is a graph concerning presidential elections. And this is the popular vote margin of the winner, And you can see here that most of the time, the candidate who got more votes became president. And then there's some exceptions here with these red dots here are the exceptions. And what I want to introduce you to is the fact that although we may not realize it because we don't necessarily think about these things all the time, we live in a really unusual time, in part because our presidential elections and other national elections are really bitterly contested, really close elections. And this is what I mean by this. If you look here, you can see here in the last 5 presidential elections from 2000 to 2016, the margin of the winner of the presidency has never been more than 8%. And in several cases, the popular vote loser has become president. And that's George W. Bush here. Then we have Bush again, and then Obama, and then Donald Trump. And you can see here that twice out of 5 elections, the popular vote loser has become president. But yet before that, it's been this long string of mostly pretty lopsided elections, with a few exceptions that maybe some of you remember, but mostly lopsided elections in which the winner wins by as much as 26% of the popular vote. And that's in 1920 when Warren Harding did that. But I want you to look back now to this earlier time in 1876 to 1896. And this is a period that is called the Gilded Age. And you can see here again, there are some pretty close elections here. And in this case, it's 6 elections in a row. And you can see here that there are 2 times when a popular vote loser became president. And although this is not my main topic today, I should just mention that the Electoral College is this sort of rickety mechanism that kind of elects the popular vote winner most of the time, but not always. And it approximates that closely enough that we don't notice most of the time that it's not actually a popular vote. But it's only in periods like now and 120 years ago that, in fact, the Electoral College doesn't do this anymore. And so there's this funny failure of the Electoral College. Now that time, 1876 to 1896, has another name. It was called the Gilded Age. And it was a time of racial division right after the Civil War and loss of civil rights by Black people with the, I would say failure of Reconstruction. Technological disruption. The Gettysburg Address was handwritten in part because the typewriter was not invented until after Abraham Lincoln had died in 1867. It was a time of massive and increasing economic inequality and deep, deep, bitter partisanship. And I hope that this sounds familiar to you because, in fact, I would say that today we live in a time of racial division, technological disruption, which leads to economic disruption, increasing inequality, and again, deep partisanship. And it's also a time of government corruption, which we can see at many levels of government. In some ways, some really shocking things happening in the news these days. And so that's another way in which our age is some kind of echo of the Gilded Age. Now, none of these things are unique to our time, but having them all happen at the same time and at a time of close electoral division makes our era a lot like the Gilded Age. And I would say that we made it out of the Gilded Age. We made it to an age which is called the Progressive Era. And so from its name, you can tell that it was a time of reform and optimism and changing the way we related to our government. And so I would say that there's a possibility of brighter days ahead and more unity nationally, but the difficulty demographically is how we're going to get the next 5 through 10 years. And I should also say that one difference between our Gilded Age and that original Gilded Age is that in the original Gilded Age, people remembered a civil war, a terrible war in which hundreds of thousands of people died, that the very existence of the nation was at stake. And there was a lot of motivation at that time to not let that happen again. And we do not have that memory behind us of something that could tear the country apart. And I'll just leave that there as something for you to think about as we think about ways to fix our government and fix our nation and help it work a little bit better. So that's the broad stage I want to set for you. And now what I want to do is I want to talk about the specific thing I wanted to address today, which is the question of representation. Now, I think most of you have heard the word gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the creative drawing of lines to give an advantage to one incumbent or candidate, or maybe an entire political party. And this is just an academic, a figure from an academic review article from the Election Integrity Project data. And these 2 authors, Martinez y Coma and Lago, looked at survey data from experts around the world and asked them about problems with democracy around the world. And I think you can see here that in the survey response of academics and other policymakers and government officials, that in fact the United States scores worse on gerrymandering than pretty much any other country. The only country that comes close is Malaysia, And then we've got a problem here in, let's see, I believe that's in Romania. And so there's a few countries where there are issues with gerrymandering, but really, as in other domains, we're number one. We're apparently very good at this. We have a problem, and it's really a bug that's endemic to American democracy. And what I want to do is show you today that this bug is indeed a problem. It distorts representation, but there are multiple ways to fix it. And we can use the principle of federalism, that is the idea that different states can all do things their own way. We can use the principle of federalism to help repair this particular bug and lead to better representation for all citizens. So let me just give you a brief lesson, kind of a primer on what a gerrymander looks like. This is a congressional map of North Carolina that was in effect up until 3 years ago. And it's a partisan gerrymander that was actually redrawn. So there was one congressional map that was drawn. There was a court-ordered redraw of the map. And you can see here this congressional map. Congressional map has blue lines here. I see a note here that says something didn't start recording until 12:12, and I'll leave that to Bora to look at the Q&A to figure that out. So this congressional map has blue lines that indicate congressional lines. And you can see here, the color here is population density, where the black color means not very many people, and the bright color means lots of people. And you can see here that these lines are drawn in what appears to be a non-random manner around these population centers. And let me just annotate this a little bit. So you can see here that, for instance, here Charlotte is encompassed in something. Here, there's some lines drawn across these communities. This is the Raleigh-Durham area, where there's a very careful line drawn around parts of Raleigh and Chapel Hill. And what's going on here is that whoever drew these lines did not draw these lines by accident. He or she drew a line across this community here, where this is bisected and split down the middle. And the bottom line here is that the vote in North Carolina is split close to 50-50 in most congressional elections this decade. And yet the congressional delegation at the time of this election had 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So it's possible to have quite a lot of influence on representation if you are the person who holds the pen. And so even though we hear about the census, we hear about the importance of counting people in the census, we hear about the importance of individual voting rights. All of those statements are true. But there's this technical thing that underlies all of that, more subtle, that really is only up until recently of interest to geeky election types like me and my crew here at Princeton. It is also possible to swing as many as 1/3 of the seats of the map by creative drawing of lines. So this is a partisan gerrymander that was in 2016. As I said, hold on for a second, let me just arrange something here. As I said, this is the former map, and it was actually redrawn by the North Carolina State Supreme Court, and the new map is actually rather different. And that telegraphs something I'll tell you about later, which is ways to fix these gerrymanders, in which North Carolina did it by court action. So I found out about this, just how big these effects could be in 2012. I've been analyzing polls and analyzing elections since 2004. It's started off as a hobby, and it's become a much more serious activity. And I made a wrong prediction in 2012. The wrong prediction I made was that I said, let's see, so I said that Democrats were likely to win more votes for Congress than Republicans. And I was right about that. And I said, therefore, they are likely to gain control of Congress. And I was wrong about that. And my readers at the time over at election.princeton.edu, I have excellent readers. I have readers who are political scientists, economists, string theorists, lawyers, including constitutional law scholars. I really have excellent readers on my blog. And one of them said, no, Sam, it's just, you're crazy because it's actually going to be a pretty heavy gerrymander this decade. And I said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And then 2012 election happened. And I was wrong. Even though Democrats won more votes, Republicans ended up in control of the chamber, 234 to 201. And we ended up with John Boehner as the Speaker of the House. And for me, this is a head scratcher. And I couldn't figure out, I realized that my readers had said something correct, which is that it was in fact creative districting, gerrymandering, which had turned the election to be less representative of the popular vote than it ever had been in the modern era, post-war era of one person, one vote. So this mismatch is a gerrymander, and this over here on the right, this is a district that for which the gerrymander is named. This is a salamander in a political cartoon from 1812, in which it was said that these counties in Massachusetts were arranged in a very strange monster, which the cartoonist called a gerrymander. after Governor Elbridge Gerry. And you can see here that this is a pretty creatively drawn district, led to, in fact, an advantage for the incumbent party. At that time, the incumbent party was only able to hold on to that advantage for 1 year and then lost the advantage completely in the next year. And so although people tried to gerrymander at that time, they didn't do such a good job of it, in part because they didn't have the data, in part because people were not as partisan as they are now and were more willing to change their allegiances. Now, I'm a good academic, and so I took my being wrong, and I was able to turn my being wrong into an article. That's what academics do. And so this is a New York Times piece that I published in February 2013, describing the great gerrymander of 2012. And I would encourage you to look it up because it pretty much holds up actually quite well. And it captures really the starting point for this. And I should say that there are others who noticed the power of partisan gerrymandering at the time. Barack Obama appears to have only noticed it at that time. Dave Daley, a journalist, noticed it at that time and wrote a whole book about it. And really, they were just a few years behind because, in fact, it was a Republican strategy under something called Red Map, which is a strategy to gain control over state legislatures, because legislatures are the entities that draw the lines in most states. And really, those campaign operatives wanted to make sure that state legislatures came under single party control so they would have a free rein in drawing districts as they liked. And so in some ways, it was a long game, a visionary plan by Republicans who saw that if they could get their hands on the gears of democracy in the back room, as it were, they could, in fact, have much more influence than voters themselves. Now, both parties can gerrymander, and this is just a result of some statistical tests that we've done at my gerrymander website, which is gerrymander.princeton.edu. And if you go to gerrymander.princeton.edu, then in fact, you can actually see the statistics underlying this. But this is an article that we had in the American Prospect. My first staff member, a legal scholar named Brian Remlinger, we counted how many partisan gerrymanders there were per state. And you can see here that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's really only one really bad partisan gerrymander per decade. This one in the 1980s is actually quite a famous one by the Democratic political boss, Phil Burton, in California. But in the 2000s, suddenly there's this bursting forth of gerrymanders. Suddenly there's 5 gerrymanders now in the most recent decade. By our statistical measures, 7 partisan gerrymanders. And this coincides with a few things going on. One thing it coincides with is computerized redistricting, where people can in fact explore hundreds of possibilities without ever setting pen to paper. They can basically do it by computer simulation. It coincides with increased partisanship. So since the 1990s has been a time of intense partisanship in the United States, where people choose up sides between Republicans and Democrats and are willing to stay with their party seemingly no matter what. Partisan loyalty is in fact at an all-time high. And so really voters have become more predictable. Computers have given us tools. And in 2010, there was this magical event in which suddenly a lot of legislatures got single party control over the process by capturing the legislatures, and in most cases also the governor's mansion, where together that's called a partisan trifecta, where you have both chambers of legislature and the governor's house. And those 3 things together allow one party to basically run roughshod over the process. And so really this is a bug in our democracy that only really became bad in the last 1 or 2 redistricting cycles. And I've forgotten to say that redistricting happens every 10 years after the census. And so it's really the census sets the stage. Districts have to be of equal population because of legal precedents from the voting rights era. And because of that, the lines must be redrawn at the beginning of every decade. And that's a tradition that we have based on decades of legal precedent. So this is just to show you that there's an idea about gerrymandering. I left out a slide where a rogues gallery of gerrymanders, but this is just to show you that I think most people have an idea that gerrymanders are crazy shapes. But in fact, it is possible to draw a really pleasing map that does not look terribly offensive to the eye and still can have a strong bias towards one party or the other. This is a pretty high profile legal case that took place in Pennsylvania a few years ago, in which the state congressional map got redrawn. And I think without looking at the bottom here, if you just look at the blue lines again, you can see that the left map and the right map don't necessarily look that different. These boundaries, they look maybe a little bit strange, but no more strange than standard congressional districts. And you can see here that the left map and the right map to the eye don't look so, neither looks so bad. But then if you look more carefully, there were choices that were made. You can see a choice that was made here on the left where Harrisburg got split down the middle. Here's another choice where Reading got split down the middle. Here's another choice where the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area got divided in a certain way. And so these choices are choices that somebody made with a pen. And you can see here in this court case, the Pennsylvania legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, proposed a particular map. And our analysis showed that a 50-50 vote in Pennsylvania would produce 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. If you look on the right, this is the map that the court ended up adopting. They took on a special master to do the drawing for them. And that special master ended up drawing a district that in the next election, after it was implemented, produced 9 Republicans and 9 Democrats, and furthermore, produced 6 close races. And what that means is that it opened up the possibility that either Democrats or Republicans could gain in future elections. And so the special master ended up drawing a map that treated the 2 parties approximately equally and gave both parties a chance to win seats in response to public opinion. So power and competitiveness then depend on line drawing. So if you follow this issue, you may know that the Supreme Court several years ago declined to intervene in partisan gerrymandering. There are those of us who are working in this space for a few years, and we were really hoping that they would intervene because the statistical methods have gotten much better. And in fact, it's actually quite easy to detect partisan gerrymanders these days, either through doing simple statistics or by comparing maps. In fact, it's possible at the touch of a button for a computer to draw millions and millions of maps. And so you can get a feeling for the entire space of possibilities by using a computer algorithm. But they declined to do so. And so in the absence of the Supreme Court doing it, who will? And I would say that there is a way to address this. And the way to address this is to use states' rights. Now, if you're a student of history, you know that states' rights is often a phrase that's used to describe all kinds of things, many of which are inimical to equality. States' rights can be used to, for instance, hold down minorities. States' rights can be used to avoid national standards in, say, partisan or racial equity. And so states' rights has been really used to give individual states a lot of latitude. But the dean of the Yale Law School, Heather Gerken, who's a collaborator of mine, Dean Gerken, has suggested that in fact states' rights can in fact allow all kinds of things to happen at the state level. And what she has suggested is that federalism, the principle that government works at different levels, national, state, and local, she suggested that federalism is an opportunity for states to experiment and to try different things in voting rights, in all domains of civil liberties and civil rights. And so what she has suggested is that in fact, maybe it's time, let's say if you're progressive, it's time to adopt blue state federalism and think about ways in which the law can be used in different states to act as what has been called laboratories of democracy, where the 50 states of the Union can all try different things and find different ways to achieve a better democracy. So this is now a resource that we have at gerrymander.princeton.edu. It shows how diverse the approaches can be. And I just want to walk you through it just a tiny bit. There's different approaches here. So one approach in lime green over here in the west, Arizona, California, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Colorado have an independent commission. So one way to break this cycle of self-dealing is to prevent legislators from being able to draw their own district lines and then get themselves elected under those lines and then do it over and over again, this positive feedback loop that is unending. So one way to break that is to have an independent commission. And voters have implemented independent commissions in all these lime green states, most recently Colorado and Michigan. And so that's one way to do it. There's other advisory commissions that are scattered throughout the country, including Utah, although they've weakened that somewhat. There's also states that have potential reform. There's, for instance, a voter initiative on the ballot in Virginia. These other states, as it turns out, sadly, that potential reform has not come to pass, and we don't have the option of reform in those states. There have been attempts in Oregon, Nebraska, Arkansas, North Dakota, Illinois. All these states, reform has failed, in part because people of the opponents of reform have taken to the courts. Now, there's other ways to do it as well. Here in the Northeast, we have advisory commissions that are not fully independent, but at least are bipartisan. And then there's legal routes against, for instance, racial gerrymandering. Here in the Deep South, from Mississippi through South Carolina, these 4 states have a way to pursue equity through racial gerrymandering cases. What I want to do today is to, for the remainder of the time, focus on a very particular way of achieving reform, which is not by good government, not by voter initiative, not by persuading legislators to do the right thing, but to do it at the ballot box. We are a little over 5 weeks away from a national general election. And what I want to show you is that voters themselves have the power to do this by force, by democratic force, by going to the ballot box and electing a bipartisan government. And what I want to show you is that that is a possibility. And I'm going to show you how one can explore that possibility, quantify it mathematically, which is what we've done, and turn that into measures of voter power. And then you can then discover that, in fact, there are places in the country where voters have a lot of power. And as I said at the beginning, in Texas here, you all have quite a lot of power. So often people say, my vote doesn't matter. I would argue with that vociferously. We've created resources at election.princeton.edu that show you where your vote does matter. And here's one example of where your vote matters. Elections matter if bipartisan control of redistricting is possible, but not guaranteed. And that matters because the presidency is 4 years. Senate races, which of course we care about, are 6 years. But redistricting is a distribution of power and an establishment of the political playing field for 10 years. And so redistricting is quite a big prize. So what we did at Princeton is we figured out, well, let's see. So some states have an independent redistricting commission. In some sense, the problem is solved there. In other states, there is no closed chamber to target. So in Arkansas, the Republicans are in charge. In Illinois, the Democrats are in charge. Hopeless situation, single party government is guaranteed. The third category is what we cared about. And under the triage principle, we work on the third category because there is a possibility of getting a better outcome. And these are places where split government is possible. So for instance, if both chambers and the governor are not of the same party, that's a possibility here in Texas, also in Minnesota. Another possibility is breaking the supermajority and forcing the legislature to deal with the governor of the opposite party. That's possible in Kansas. And then finally, getting a split legislature where the governor has no input. That's North Carolina. And what we've done here is we've taken individual state legislative ratings, worked out the probability that a Democrat or Republican will win either of them, put it all through a mathematical model, and figured out which states there may be a possibility of bipartisan control. And these are the states that we've discovered this in. From left to right is Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Minnesota, Kansas, and Connecticut. And these are the 6 states where the probability of bipartisan control is somewhere between 20 and 80%. And in particular, Republicans currently have single party control in Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and Kansas. And Democrats have or are close to having single party control in Connecticut and Minnesota. And what that means is that these are places where voters can actually make a difference by either electing a Democratic legislature in the first 4 states I named, or electing at least one Republican chamber in the last 2 states I named, Minnesota and Connecticut. So what we've done is we figured out not only which states can do this, but we've also figured out which districts are the critical ones. And what we've done is we've basically done numerical simulations, mathematical simulations, where we say, well, if we move a few votes from one column to the other, or if we add a few votes to one column or the other, then we change the probability that that critical district, that district is won by one party or the other. And so moving a few votes, in this example here, moves the Democrats' win probability from 86% to 84%. That's a change of 2 percentage points of probability. And so what we've done is we've calculated the power of voters in every single legislative district in America. We've then converted that to a model of where bipartisan control is possible. And then we've taken that and we've quantified exactly how much power there is to moving votes in each district. And the idea here is that to a math person, it's not too complicated. There's a probability that state bipartisan control might hinge on a particular legislative race. There's a number of congressional seats that's potentially at stake in the state, S, and there's how many people vote in that district. And we can take these together and figure out how powerful voters are across the country. Let's see, I'm just having a little bit of a slide issue here. Sorry, just, okay, there we go. And so we've done this, and this is now, let me actually switch out here and show you what this looks like in the interactive. If you go to election.princeton.edu, we can go to this feature, which we call redistricting Moneyball. And we called that because Moneyball is this principle of baseball optimization where on a very limited budget, the Oakland A's were able to become a World Series winning team by basically being hyper quantitative and clever about exactly how they allocated their resources. And you can see here that Texas has among the most powerful voters in the country. And you can see here that all of Texas, as we scroll around Texas, there's this unusual concentration of voter power in Dallas-Fort Worth. That's because, as I think you all know, Dallas-Fort Worth has become more and more purple on the red-blue divide, and therefore more likely to have swing districts. And you can see here that there's something like 10 districts here that are swingable in Dallas, Tarrant, Collin, and Denton counties. And if you look over here on the left, there are districts over here that are in fact in this area that are quite powerful. And so we've quantified voter power here on the left as redistricting voter power, and this is the per voter power of individual voters in these particular places. So let's see. So let me now go back to my slides and continue where I left off. Apologize for being so casual here. So the idea here is that in fact, you can be powerful in your own community by getting out the vote, by registering people to vote in the few days remaining, by donating to campaigns. And as you may know, campaigns in fact are much cheaper to run on the state legislative level. And so you in Texas have a lot of power over redistricting fairness. And I should say that these 6 states together account for 93 congressional seats, which is 1/5 of the chamber. And what that means is that voters this November at the ballot box have the capacity to bring about bipartisan fairness in 1/5 of Congress. And that's basically by going out to vote in Texas. Here in this slide, I show you Kansas as well. There's a cluster of hotspots in Johnson County. So let me just finish by saying that, that one of the ideas that really animates this project I've been telling you about is something that Teddy Roosevelt brought up now over 100 years ago. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was a Republican president. After he left office, he started saying what he really thought. It was a time when presidents waited until after leaving office to say what they really thought. And you can see here that he said, the national government belongs to the whole American people. He said, our whole experiment is meaningless unless we are to make this a democracy in the fullest sense of the word. And he said that if the minority is as powerful as the majority, there's no use of having political contests at all, for there's no use in having a majority. So I would submit to you that we have an opportunity as citizens to, in fact, use the levers of democracy to repair democracy in ways that legislators may not be inclined to do themselves, and to use our power as voters to deploy our discretion to help bring about these ideals that Teddy Roosevelt espoused so long ago. I will stop there. I've gone a little bit over time. I'd be delighted to have questions from anybody. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wong, for that very informative presentation. If you're an audience member and you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask your questions. In the meantime, a lot of what you talked about was about getting bipartisan governments elected. And I want to talk a little bit about what would the next steps be once a bipartisan government is elected. Once, say in Texas, we elect a bipartisan government, what should the government do to reduce gerrymandering? And in that process, how can citizens be involved to make sure that gerrymandering doesn't happen?
Sure, Vishak, that's a great question. We have a theory. Our theory is that, in fact, there are different ways in which citizens can make a difference. And in particular, we think that up here in the white boxes here on the top, that's what happens behind closed doors. And there are different ways in which people can get involved. Broadly speaking, the ways that citizens can make a difference are firstly by offering public input, and Texas is a state where public input is accepted in the drawing of districts. Secondly, you can use tools to report who you are, whatever community you may live in. You should report your community to make sure that it gets fairly treated. So in fact, my team has developed a tool that is called representable.org. If you go to representable.org, it's a way to report your community and upload it in digital form to, in fact, tell redistrictors what you'd like to see. In the case of Texas congressional districting, it's done by an act of the legislature. And that means that the legislature and Governor Abbott will have to work together to come up with a map. It's more complicated in the state legislature because there's a backup mechanism that is still dominated by one party. Every state's got its own rules. One difficulty is that in order to know what to do, one needs to know the rules of your home state. And so in some states, the thing to do is to pass a voter initiative. In other states, it's to use the power at the ballot box. And so every state's got its own approach.
So when we talk about redistricting, a lot of the pushback that comes is from politicians, both Democrats and Republicans. And they use a popular rationale that they use is that we've won, my party has won, and because we've won, we have the right to draw the lines however we see fit. How do you convince politicians otherwise? How would you respond to that, that this principle should not hold true?
Under certain, so I would say broadly, just don't try. Broadly, the best route to getting reform is to, in about half of the states, 24 states if I remember correctly, it is possible to pass things like these commissions by voter initiative. And basically a direct determination by the voters of a state can set up a redistricting commission. That was what was done in the last election by Michigan and Colorado. Actually, in Colorado, the legislature also had a say. One way to do it is to appeal to the legislators' better natures and ask them to do the right thing. I will let you decide for yourself how likely that is. Another way to do it that actually worked surprisingly well was in Virginia, which is namely in Virginia, the Republicans had the majority in the legislature, but it looked like they were going to lose power. And it was possible to see in advance that they might lose power. And they were concerned about being no longer in control of redistricting. And at that moment, they expressed openness to reform. And the Democrats, who were in the minority, also wanted reform, because it's usually the minority party that wants reform. And they were actually able to come together and pass a bipartisan constitutional amendment. Now, in the next election, sure enough, the Democrats came in. As it turns out that many of them lost heart for reform once they were in the majority. But a number of Democrats who had promised to support reform kept their word and ended up voting for that amendment to go in front of the voters. So I would say one situation in which it's possible to get reform is situations where one party is threatened with losing power and is worried about having done to it what it had done in the past. So states that have that kind of situation include currently North Carolina, Georgia, and maybe in the next decade, Texas. And so I think there are places where that kind of fear of the future may be used to motivate politicians.
So, right, when we think about politics a lot, we think about, especially nowadays, we think about polarization, we think about hyperpartisanship. And you briefly talked about this earlier, about the roles that hyperpartisanship plays in gerrymandering. And I'm curious to see if you think that gerrymandering is a symptom or if it's a cause of hyperpartisanship and polarization that we're seeing within our institutions.
Well, I would characterize gerrymandering as something that is, over most of history, has been done to protect individual legislators. And really, gerrymandering as a team sport is something that's come up over the last 20 years or so. And that team sport gerrymandering comes about because the two parties have become further and further apart and have little common ground. And in the states where gerrymandering is the worst, where they're equally divided so that control can tilt, I can't remember if I said it, but up to 1/3 of the legislative seats of a state can be under the map drawer's control. And so there's a huge prize in the form of being able to create an advantage one way or the other way, depending on who's in charge. And so really, I would say that, that partisanship is one of the ingredients that leads to gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a mechanism by which partisanship can lead to distortions. And basically the polarization is the raw material from which gerrymanders become desirable as a policy outcome by legislators.
How I think of it a little bit is if you gerrymander a district and you have, say, a bunch of Democratic voters in one district, the Democratic incumbent can then move as far left as they can. Not too far left, but has some authority to move more further left without worrying about losing re-election. So do you think if there's more bipartisan, fair district lines drawn, do you think it could reduce some of the partisanship and polarization that we're seeing?
Yes, it is possible to, let's see if I have it here in front of me. It is possible to do that. Just to give you a sense of that with data, we seem to have time to show data, so I'm going to just do it. So here, this is now histograms of partisanship, where on the horizontal axis, if a district is 100% Republican, it's on the left. If it's 100% Democratic, it's on the right. And then all the congressional districts in 2012 are in between. And I think what you can see here, wait, am I sharing this?
No, we can't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I've messed up. Let me work on this some more. Let's see. How did I do this? I apologize. Let's try that again. There we go. And so, see, if you look here, this is now a histogram of congressional districts, and you can see here that a district that's 100% Republican is here, 100% Democratic is here. And you can see here that there's this shape, and the natural shape it's kind of funny. Like statistically, you would not really expect this, where you have these two bumps. This is called a bimodal histogram, where wins are pretty safe for Republicans or pretty safe for Democrats. That is what happens when you have gerrymandering. And you can see here that if there's either Republicans or Democrats in charge, these wins are pretty far from 50-50, both in the Republican-controlled case, also the Democrat-controlled case. And if you take out those outcomes, you end up with a much smoother histogram. So basically what this means, to translate from math into English, is that competition is suppressed in gerrymandering. And what that means is that legislators don't have to worry about the general election. They only have to worry about members of their own party. And that leads to a situation which you have described, which is that if you only have to respond to members of your own party, then you do not have to be answerable to all the voters. And so one question, I think, in terms of, let's say we're trying to fix democracy, is to find ways to make democracy more responsive to voters. One way to do it is to get rid of gerrymandering through the establishment of independent commissions. Another way might be to have a different voting rule. So there are voting reforms that have been proposed, such as ranked choice voting. And the right solution is going to depend a lot on the political culture of a particular place, where depending on the specific political circumstances, you might want one reform or a different reform, or maybe some reforms are not even available because of the peculiarities of local law. So I would say, broadly speaking, that, that this lack of competition feeds this partisanship that you're describing.
I have a question from Dr. Takeuchi, who's a political science professor at SMU.
I see that. I'm looking at the Q&A now, yeah.
Dr. Takeuchi is wondering, to what extent would the negative impact of gerrymandering be alleviated if more people voted in primaries?
Wouldn't fix it, because if you have a district, say, that's 80% Democratic or 57% Republican, even if everybody voted in primaries, you would still end up having a district where the general election was had very little suspense. And so I think there are problems that can be solved by having higher participation in primaries. And in fact, primaries, I mean, there's a whole other category of reform which includes things like opening up primaries to nonpartisans or people who are not registered to either party. And so there are things that can be done to improve the outcome of primaries. That's another place where perhaps ranked choice voting might be a good solution. But gerrymandering itself would not be addressed, as far as I can tell, by increased voter participation in primaries.
And there's another question from Professor Caroline Brettel, who think is a very interesting and relevant question is the question of what do we do if people aren't interested in fixing it? What do we do then?
Well, Professor Patel, like I said, every state's got its own approach. And so some states you want to force bipartisan government. Other states, you may want to pass a voter initiative. One thing that we are thinking about is a public challenge where when partisan control is about to change hands, that's a moment of unique vulnerability. All these are ways to do it. There is a national way to do it. There's something called H.R. 1, which is a bill that's passed the House of Representatives, but is dead on arrival in the Senate, which establishes redistricting commissions, independent commissions across the nation. And that is within the scope of the Constitution. So one possible way to improve matters would be to pass a national law, which didn't go anywhere this time around. But if there's a change in government in January, then one can imagine that that would have perhaps some traction.
Speaking of constitutionality and legality, we had a participant wondering if you've analyzed how gerrymandering might influence potential changes to the Constitution.
Influence potential changes to the Constitution. So there's a couple ways to answer this. The direct answer is that it doesn't have any influence because gerrymandering is something that affects representation in the 50-50 range for the most part. And changes to the Constitution require pretty large events like 3/4 of the states ratifying an amendment. Another way to think about the question is there a way to solve gerrymandering through constitutional action? And I think that is still an open question, although with the current Supreme Court, it seems unlikely to ever do anything about it. But I would say that there may be ways to use the Constitution to combat gerrymandering, although currently I would say it's kind of unlikely for the next decade or so. By the way, on this point, I would really recommend a dissenting opinion by Justice Elena Kagan in a famous partisan gerrymandering case called Rucho versus Common Cause. That's she lays out actually quite strongly, quite clearly what the evils of gerrymandering are. And ironically, actually, Chief Justice Roberts in that same case also lays out in a really clear way the evils of gerrymandering. It's just that he ends up by saying, we're not going to do anything about it.
This is more of a personal opinion question, right? But a lot of these hard dissents in the Supreme Court later provide fertile ground for reversals in the future. Do you think that there could be a time when the Supreme Court backtracks what it said about partisan gerrymandering and outlaws it? Or do you think that's unlikely ever?
Some dissents are so powerful that they are worth reading, even though the justice who wrote the decision did not win. And I can think of famous cases in the past where we don't feel the same way about that case that we do now. Plessy versus Ferguson comes to mind. In the domain of gerrymandering, the reason I recommended Justice Kagan's dissent is that it really lays out in a really clear way this major flaw in our democracy. Now, in the future, could this ever be addressed? Look, this is a pretty polarized time. And I think the very stability of our government is actually at this point under some question. And I think that, like I have to admit, I'm in some suspense over how our democracy will do in the next 5 to 10 years. I do think that in 5 to 10 years, there is the possibility of a second progressive era where some of these reforms can be considered in a measured way once we get away from this bitter partisanship we're at now. And at that time, I think Justice Kagan's dissent is going to look pretty good. Now, there is huge difficulty in getting to there from here. And one of the difficulties in our society right now is that we're moving towards a different political center. We are moving towards greater diversity. There are a lot of difficult changes that people are experiencing, including people in heartland states and in rural states who have had really hard times. And addressing all these needs of all these different communities in the United States is a tough challenge. And right now the building's on fire, and maybe after the building fire gets extinguished a little bit, some of these things could be readdressed through federal action. That having been said, like I said, HR1 would be one way of possibly addressing it. I think the better route at this point would be to do it through an act of Congress.
Mhm. So if the goal of redistricting is to help elect bipartisan government, or at least to make the playing field level, we have a participant who's curious if this type of redistricting isn't gerrymandering itself, right? If you're purposely drawing districts to be competitive, what's the difference between that and partisan gerrymandering?
Yeah, I would put it a little bit differently, and I think I may have perhaps created a wrong impression. It's not so much that the goal is bipartisanship. I would say that I think that a well-designed democracy ought to be responsive to voters' opinions and ought to have representatives who are responsive to those who elected them. Like I said, little d democracy, little r republicanism. Um, and those challenges are the ones that I'm talking about. Now, it may be that, in fact, if there's a period of single party dominance, as there has been in US history, that whole part that between the first Gilded Age and our Gilded Age, there were large stretches of time when one party or the other was in fact dominant. Republicans were dominant for a while, then Democrats were dominant for a while. And in that situation, okay, well, under that situation, then single party government might in fact be appropriate. The one risk is that relying on representatives to do the job of making districting fair leaves the possibility that they will just draw lots of single district gerrymanders for themselves. In other words, a bipartisan gerrymander where they're all safe and they're all insulated from the will of voters. And that is the problem with relying on legislatures to do this job. A better job of reform would be to have an independent commission. And that gets back to HR1. So in some happy future in which HR1 becomes law, and independent commissions do the job of redrawing state legislatures, then you've broken the feedback loop where the legislators are not in charge of drawing their own lines.
I think a large part of data people, what they do is measuring the problem, right? It's trying to find metrics that help you measure problems really well, or as close to as accurately as possible. Edward, one of our participants, was wondering if you have any measures about the extent of gerrymandering, of partisan gerrymandering in Texas.
Well, Edward, I would say it depends on what you're trying to measure. So one kind of, the kind of gerrymandering that got me super interested in this problem was partisan representation, where the representation of the two major parties is not commensurate with what you would expect in a neutrally drawn system. But there's also racial gerrymandering. Texas used to be more of a partisan gerrymander, but ironically, there are several things that seem to have gotten in the way of legislators doing as effective a job as they could have. One is that there's been demographic change in Texas. And so in fact, just to give you an example, 2 years ago, even though Beto O'Rourke lost his Senate race to Ted Cruz by 2 points statewide, O'Rourke actually won a majority of legislative districts. If you counted up the votes within each legislative district, it looked like O'Rourke appears to have won a majority of districts. And what that means is that there was a successful partisan gerrymander in some sense where there was lots of close wins for the Republican side. But as demographics have shifted, all of those went underwater. So it's like building a levee that wasn't quite high enough. The other thing that makes it hard to judge these things is that partisan gerrymandering is not the only kind of gerrymandering. There's also racial gerrymandering. And so one of the challenges for people who are trying to draw partisan gerrymanders in the United States is that in most places in the United States, race and party go together. So for instance, in most parts of the United States, you might expect Hispanic voters to be largely Democratic. That's not true in Texas. In Texas, there's a substantial fraction of Hispanic voters who are in fact politically conservative. And now the question is, what is it you're trying to achieve when you draw lines? And to put it baldly, redistrictors may be motivated by party. They may be motivated by race. In the last several cycles, if I remember correctly, Texas has added 5, I think, congressional districts to its delegation on account of growth in the Hispanic population, but has not added added any Hispanic members of the congressional delegation during that time. So, so that's a way in which, if you're drawing the lines, you have to decide who it is you're trying to advantage or disadvantage. And I think that in some ways, ironically, Texas has been a little bit hard to really get a handle on by people who would like to gain a partisan advantage.
That's a really interesting point that you brought up, that Hispanic population in Texas has increased, but Hispanic representation, at least in government, has not increased. And this is something I think we see across America, right? Congress, our state legislatures, they're not representative of the country. This is a question from Usha Kumari, who asks that in other countries, there's been this practice of picking representatives that represent the country as a whole. For example, I think in Lebanon, there are numbers of seats for the different religious minorities, similar in Pakistan. Are these viable solutions for the US to also consider, especially as, do you think that geographic representation is less important and representation of identity, representation of seeing people who look and talk and feel like you are more important?
A solution like that would be difficult to implement in the United States because of the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to give equal justice under law. And that can be used to protect minority representational rights. But I would say that it would be difficult in court to defend such a rules change on the grounds that it would create a special class of citizen. There are different versions of this that could be tried. There's another version that you haven't mentioned, which is, I believe in Germany and in Mexico, there's been a reform in which people are elected by district, and then the national vote is added up. And then representatives are added to make sure that the representation is approximately proportionate to the national vote. And so Germany's done that. I believe that Mexico does some version of that. And so that'd be another way to do it. Doing that requires a constitutional amendment. And that would require ratification by 3/4 of the states. So I would say that in theory, that could be a good fix. I tend to be really cautious about these things. And I would say that the kind of thing that I work on with my group here at my place is that we tend to really focus on things that we think can be practically doable on the time scale of a decade. So certainly if we have a collapse of the constitutional order and we have to rewrite the Constitution or something like that happens, then such a thing could happen. But it is not something that we are working on.
Does ranked choice voting play a role here, or is that not feasible?
So this is similar to the question about full participation in primaries. Ranked choice voting does not solve this problem at all, because what ranked choice voting does is it takes a district as it is drawn and then finds the most acceptable representative within that district. But if you have districts that are drawn to begin with that are, say, in the case of the North Carolina gerrymander, are 80% for Democrats in 3 districts, 55% for Republicans in 10 districts, having a ranked choice voting in each one of those districts gives you a broadly acceptable representative for a district of that composition. So ranked choice voting solves certain problems, but this is not one of them.
I just want to take a moment and implore the audience, if they have any, to continue asking them in the Q&A section.
These are great questions. I'm glad to have them.
So Dr. Bredel has another question. And this regards to that final quote from President Roosevelt. I think what we see right now, and this is something that we hear a lot from the left, is the disproportionality in the Electoral College. Like, for example, Wyoming has Wyoming has a population of a Dallas-Fort Worth suburb, but has 2 senators. But all of Texas also has 2 senators. Do you think that this is a bug in American democracy? If so, how do you fix it? And if not, why do you think it's not a bug?
For Dr. Bredel, I'm going to type the name of an article by Bernard Groffman and Jonathan Servas, and I'll put it in the chat too. I see you're making questions go away, which is very efficient of you. Never mind. Anyway, it's Groffman and Servas. The direct answer to your question in regard to the Electoral College is that getting rid of those senators actually doesn't fix it very much in the Electoral College. If you look back historically, Groffman and Servas have found that taking away those 2 electors per state mostly does not change the outcome of presidential elections. Specifically, it does not change the inversions that have occurred, where an inversion is defined as a popular vote electoral college split. So there are certainly issues with having senators be counted, having Senate-based electors in the electoral college, but it turns out to not be the principal problem in the electoral college. It has to do a little bit more with ways in which swing states happen to be arranged and ways in which there's a skew towards rural states broadly. But it turns out that getting rid of those Senate electors doesn't actually fix that problem. Probably the only real, there are 2 kinds of fix to the electoral college in the sense of finding a way to have it reflect the majority view. One fix is to have a national popular vote. And another fix is to start having deals between states. Like, I'll give you an example. There have been 4 failures of the electoral college to elect the popular vote winner since from the 1800s till now. 3 of those would have not happened if there had been the following deal. California and Texas sign a deal. And the deal is whoever wins the popular vote, all the electors for both California and Texas go to that popular vote winner. And if California and Texas were to sign such a compact, then that would actually get rid of 3 out of 4 popular vote inversions. So I think, the simple answer is have a national popular vote, and then there may be cleverer answers that can deal with that. The one place where the Senate leads to strange distortions is the Senate itself. I mean, I think it's not really appreciated, but the Senate itself is a gerrymander. The reason that we have 2 Dakotas, like, why do we need 2 Dakotas? Wouldn't 1 Dakota be enough? But in fact, Republicans in the Gilded Age era split the Dakotas into 2 states so that they could get 4 senators instead of 2 senators. And so it's possible to, in fact, get much more representation. And so, there are distortions in the Senate. They happen to collide in a really unfavorable way with the urban-rural divide that's present in the United States right now. And yes, I see in the chat someone's making fun of me for imagining that Texas and California would agree on something. Well, I didn't say it was going to happen. I'm just describing ways in which there could be a fix. And I can imagine some scenario in which Texas and California agree to do something that maximizes their power and stick it to the rest of the country. And so I think that one could imagine it happening. I'm not putting money on it, but I can imagine it someday in the future being attractive.
Do you know how frequently state governments use algorithms or use computers, right, to redistrict, and what are some downsides of doing so?
Okay, so let's see. I'm looking at the question here. Using data and redistricting, which is part of the question here in the chat, in the Q&A. Using data and redistricting is a great idea. My team has created a resource called openprecincts.org, and this is openly available data on voting and precincts to allow anybody to get access. Hey, Vishak, actually, you know what? Don't delete the question. I'm looking at it. You're like making my head spin there. I'll remember the question, but it's okay. That one's fine. But I just it's like watching ripples disappear in water. Like, where did the question go? So using data is good because it keeps people honest by giving citizens a way to score plans, by making everything as transparent as possible. Using algorithms is a really bad idea, in my view. Let me just, rather than state my conclusion, the difficulty with algorithms is that algorithms still allow a lot of possibilities. And you can draw a map that really maximizes, say, shape, prettiness, at the expense of other things, and you can still end up with quite a partisan plan. And there are lots of local priorities that are generally not captured in an algorithmically drawn map. And so I think one should be very careful about it. I think it is theoretically possible to have an algorithm that respects shape and population and communities of interest and treats the parties fairly. So one could do that. But fundamentally, redistricting is an activity of human beings. And if I have an algorithm that sticks the eastern part of Fort Worth and the western part of Dallas together, and then leaves out other parts of the cities, one should think about whether that's a good algorithm or not. So I think that under current political conditions, it is really hard to get people to agree to draw districts automatically. And in fact, I would not agree to that if I were to have a role in redistricting. Algorithms do have an important use, which is they can be used to gauge the fairness of a human drawn map. And so you can use an algorithm to draw millions or billions of combinations. There's a particular algorithm called Monte Carlo Markov chain analysis, or MCMC for short. And you can basically use MCMC to draw billions of maps. And that gives you a population it gives you a universe of maps to compare a given map to and decide whether it's fair or not. So I think there's a role for algorithms. I just think that drawing maps that are actually used for voting has difficulties. I see we're doing electoral college now. This is great.
Yeah. So let's have some electoral college questions. Would states allocating their electoral votes proportionally, what would that do?
Yeah, it turns out it wouldn't fix anything. It is surprising. This is a logical, okay, so first off, it turns out that allocating electoral votes by congressional district turns out would not have repaired most of those electoral vote, popular vote inversions. Again, I refer you to the Groffman and Servas paper, on which they go into it, and they found out that actually that's not the case. Secondly, there's a wrinkle here. It's not that Maine and Nebraska do it proportionally; they do it by congressional district. And when they do it by congressional district, that sounds like a good idea, but we just got done talking about how states can gerrymander their congressional maps. Okay, well, if you have a gerrymandered congressional map, now a 50-50 vote in Pennsylvania would lead to a 13-5 split of electoral votes. Seems like a bad idea. And so, in fact, doing it by congressional district is kind of a weird move. Doing it proportionally, which is what Betsy Brody's question is a different topic, which is like, okay, let's say that if it's 50-50, then maybe in Pennsylvania's case, give 9 to, say, 9 to Trump and 9 to Biden. It turns out that only really works if you have fractional electors. And unless you're willing to do fractional electors, which is like a weird idea, unless you're willing to do fractional electors, it turns out that proportional electors also does not fix problems in the past. And so what that suggests is that it would also not fix problems in the future. How would I see Ben Stutz has a question. How would national popular vote work with no candidate receiving a majority of votes? Yeah, that is a good question. So in fact, that would lead to some kind of crisis. And I don't have a good answer to that. It in fact would be somewhat challenging to do that. I believe that the way that the current reform proposals are written, the presidency goes to the candidate who wins the most votes. This is a situation where it would be better to have some kind of reform like ranked choice voting. I think Ben Stutz has come up with a good objection to having a national popular vote. And that concern in particular does need to be addressed in figuring out how to conduct a national presidential election. Oh, Ben's full of questions here. Should we do his other one?
Yeah, let's
yeah. So Ben Stutz asks again. He wants to know how the ideal independent redistricting commission work. Vishak, is this okay that I'm reading the questions?
Yeah, of course.
How would members be selected? How would they prioritize? Okay, so he wants to know how would it work. One set of rules that's been implemented in Michigan, California, and Colorado is that the redistricting commission has Democrats and Republicans and commissioners who say that they're not affiliated with either party. And that commission has a special voting rule where it has to pass not with a simple majority, but with a supermajority. And what that means is that for any plan to pass, you either have to have Democrats and Republicans working together, or one of the parties has to win over the independent commissioners. And so that supermajority vote would then prevent partisanship from being the primary driving factor. And I will say that California commissioners, California is obviously a heavily Democratic state. California commissioners, including Republicans, spoke very well of the process. And they all felt, the Republican commissioners didn't necessarily like the outcome, but they felt that they were treated fairly. Members can be selected either by application or in the case of Michigan, weirdly by random drawing. And then the commission can in fact have rules that it is constrained by. The Michigan law actually specifically says that jurisdictions shouldn't necessarily be split, that communities of interest be respected, that districts be reasonably compact, so not have funny shapes, and that the two major parties be treated similarly to one another, and that racial groups be treated fairly. And so it's in fact possible to put criteria into the law, and then the commission would have to follow those criteria. So that's probably the best reform, is to have a set of criteria and a process in which there has to be some kind of quasi-consensus that's at work. And that's been implemented in several states, and it appears to be a reasonably successful approach.
We have a question about the election process from the chat from Julie. It's about, with every state creating their own rules for elections, how does a national election remain fair?
So we're talking about like a national popular vote, I guess that's the context of her question. I think it's her question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so here's one of the difficulties of a national popular vote, if you stop and think about it. I'll give you an example. The Constitution says that people over the age of 18 shall not be discriminated against on account of age for purposes of voting. And so it sets a voting age of 18 or higher. But there's nothing to stop any state in the country from saying, let's make the voting age 13. And so one of the difficulties with our federalist system is that there are different rules in different states. Within certain constraints, it leads to a virtuous cycle where, let's say, I'll give you an example, Julie. It creates pressure for every state to make sure that as many people vote as possible. And so it creates incentives to ensure high participation in elections. And so that would be what I would call a relatively virtuous incentive. On the other hand, non-uniformity in how people vote, for instance, in your next question in the chat, you mentioned rules about whether people who have served their time as ex-felons should be reenfranchised. And that's a domain in which the rule is quite different in different states. And so one would have to address these things. I think a national popular vote potentially addresses quite a lot of problems, but it does lead to questions like yours, in which one would have to address conceptual questions like exactly what constitutes uniform voting rights across the US. And so I think that's a legitimate concern.
And I think before we wrap up, I have one final question.
Sure.
And a lot of what we've talked today isn't very optimistic. We talked a lot about problems, and you yourself said that you're worried about the state of democracy 5 or 10 years from now. But as always, somewhere there's something to give us hope. And I'd like to ask you, what gives you hope and what keeps you motivated to do the work that you do? And if you'd be willing to share that with us.
Well, I am an optimist. And it would be hard to work on democracy reform without being an optimist. And I would say this: voting rights are under threat, as they haven't been before in decades. And yet, Blacks and Hispanics in America used to be nearly deprived of the right to vote. And although there are still offenses to voting rights, they aren't as large as the offenses of, say, the Jim Crow era. Partisan gerrymandering is a domain where one might say, well, the Supreme Court declined to act and we're in a pretty bad situation. But if you look at numerical measures of partisan gerrymandering, in fact, we as a nation appear to have solved more than half of the problem that was set up in 2010. And so that's a situation in which there appear to have been reforms that have been put in place, not everywhere, but reforms that have been put in place to reduce the impact of partisan gerrymandering. So I think that there are ways to make progress in these things. It's easy to focus on the bad part, but it should not be forgotten that progress has been made and is being made. This is a tough political time. And I would say that, that there are demographic trends in which young people are of different opinion than their elders. And I think that's a large shift in the United States as the United States moves towards greater diversity. And one challenge is, how do we get to that future nation 5 to 10 years from now? I think, frankly, that it's easy to be pessimistic in the face of a government at a national level that's not been very responsive to popular needs. And in a time when we have climate change and threats to the integrity of government and international conflict and economic distress, these are hard problems. And I would just say that there are decencies that we take for granted, but this is a time when ordinary people have to do much more than the ordinary amount in order to keep what we had and to build a better future. And, you know, democracy doesn't take care of itself. We have to be actively engaged citizens. In the domains I've worked in, I see progress. And that progress is sometimes slow. But in fact, I have seen positive progress in the domain, at least in the gerrymandering domain. So in fact, I think that it is worth fighting for. And I hope that people who are here today will keep on fighting.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wang. If you're interested in the Princeton Election Consortium, am I saying that right? Feel free to learn more about it at Princeton at election.princeton.edu. And we hope to see you again here at the Tower Center.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wong. Thank you, Vishak, and hope everyone has a great day.